And you've come, Snape, to give your position on this matter? From the pastoral, educational sphere? Around the cabinet table in the ministry, Cleus Lupin looked up from the report that Severus Snape had given him. It was early in the morning, so early in fact that it could easily have been mistaken for late the previous night. Few ministerial wizards were with them, several were on call to the reciprocators, such as Demescujule, the head of the Aurors, Dave Mullen and both Lestranges, should those wizards on duty that night need them. As such they had been on leave for the day and would not resume ministerial duties until the next evening. Others were working on the revised social and fiscal policies which would integrate the European Parliament's laws with those of Britain, a meeting which had occurred the evening before with the entire cabinet and would have involved all still had Cleus not received the message from Severus Snape regarding Fraser Blewett. Enough now were available for Cleus to call on in order to qualify Snape for the cabinet hearing, for Cleus was keen to minimize the impact of this on the school and in the wider world. He knew that several of the cabinet would not be so keen to subdue it, though. It was illegal to use the term misborn no matter what, for the connotations that it suggested. The older cabinet post holders, Herbert, Jones, Dainty, Fortescue, had been outraged at the short message that Cleus had received during the social and fiscal policy hearing and had insisted they be present to hear what Snape had to say. Others not involved in the prior meeting had been enlisted to make up the numbers. Mick Mullen had ambled in, late, put his feet up, crossed at the ankle, on the desk before winking at Severus and swigging from his coffee cup. Gregor of the Department of Mysteries was the too, and Snape had forced the questions from his head regarding Tabitha as he had arrived, shuffling slowly across the onyx-blocked floor and muttering to himself loudly, immersed almost entirely in his own world. It would be pointless in any case, were he to talk to Gregor, the muttering head of that mad and crazy department. He may well get an answer, but whether it would in any way relate to his question was a different matter. Lucius Malfoy had sent, on gilded paper in beautiful handwritten script, his apologies for having to be at the fiscal integration meeting. Herbert, head of the Ministry for Defense, had been seated well before the start of the meeting, as if he had been there all night, and the previous day, inanimate save for his leafing through a pile of parchments with official ministry stamps on them. Jane Jones, of Wizardly Transport, Dulcie Dainty, her pinched features focused beadily on Snape, and Evelyn Fortescue of the Magical Protection Agency, three witches opposed, in general, to Cleus Lupin, sat upright and still, as if poised to pounce on any weak assertion made by either Cleus or Severus Snape. Indeed, Snape pushed the document in the direction of Cleus Lupin, who lifted his spectacles and read the cover before turning over the first page and scanning the contents. He replied, before letting go his glasses and looking at Snape. You do indeed appear to be reporting a somewhat grave situation unfolding at Hedgewood's. How are you controlling this? Opposite, Snape breathed in sharply. Cleus, and his usual manner of blunt indifference towards those to whom he spoke when trying to ascertain the truth, was already beginning to annoy him, and he swallowed down the biting comments that always arose in his mind at times like these. Yes, Severus. Dulcie Dainty leaned forwards, looking up from the minutes that were being written in front of her eyes, which were a summary of the document that Cleus had just read. We are all keen to know, such is your responsibility for all the impressionable children you have in your care. Snape shifted, unused to the charming manner of the head of the control of magical creatures, before inclining his head. He had been to see Dulcie on several occasions since he had begun to research a potion for Remus Lupin. Of the vampires she had under her control, in the security of Azkaban, one had been useful, having provided tissue samples that Snape had used for his initial tests. Wizards, Snape looked around him, nodding at the wizards of the female persuasion, witches. I have merely used sanctions as laid down by school policy. As I told you in my briefing, Owl Fraser Blewett had used the term towards a non-wizard student at Hedgewood's during an argument on Saturday at a Quidditch match. He has been punished at school, his privileges withdrawn and his parents notified. HMPH. Snorted Gregor, though probably by accident. The head of the Department of Mysteries was staring at the ever-moving whirl of cloud that was the cabinet room's ceiling, though several wizards nodded in agreement. Bluewit's family were suspected conjurists, and it would mean little if anything to them that their son had used the M-word. Of course, I've explained to the boy that, as well as his education being in jeopardy, his meeting with the Urors who arrived this evening to Hedgewood's meant that the incident would amount to an Uror record. He was reprimanded by Yara Gifford and Phlogistus Spim. The record should be with your department, Herbert, he added. It is where we go from here that is important, Snape continued, looking at Callias. As the government now controls Hedgewoods, it is vital that we agree to the response that is taken. The question is, should the boy still be at school? Herbert looked at Callias too. For such a transgression of the law, towards a non-wizard at Hedgewoods, when you are trying to foster integration and harmony between wizards and non-wizards. A murmur arose. The point made by Herbert became an instant conversation point as it appeared on the minutes before them. Several wizards nodded in agreement. Jane Jones and Dulcie Dainty both nodded to one another, and Gregor, though probably in another example of coincidence, looked around the cabinet chamber and shouted, yes. Callias looked around at the wizards too. Were they assenting to Bluewit's expulsion? Students had been expelled for less. Yet this was a delicate situation and required similar handling. The only wizard who had not spoken on the matter was McMullen, and it was at that moment he chose to unfold his legs at the ankle and take his feet off the table. The cabinet wizards stopped talking one by one and looked at Mullen, respecting his unspoken signal that he wished to speak. If we do that, then that will only serve to drive a wedge between the wizard and non-wizard students at Hedgewoods, in my opinion. The last three words he spoke with a grin, and he waved his hand over his coffee cup. The water vapor from the instantly boiling coffee spiraled from the beverage's surface. He waited for one or two of the ministers to speak before shuffling upright into his seat from his semi-recumbent position. Think about it. We expel Bluewit and it sends a signal to those wizards who also come from homes with a strong conjurist background. Parents will become defensive, opinion will become polarized. Now, I'm not saying what Bluewit's done is right, but the Urors have dealt with him and let him off with a caution. Should you, Professor Snape, be seen to expel him, it would imply that Hedgewoods believes the Uror action was inadequate. We need a united front. All the more reason to let it be known not acceptable here. Explained Evelyn Fortescue shrilly. I have relatives of non-wizard heritage who have had to suffer the ignominy of being slandered misborn. She shook her head and looked down. Snape meanwhile had been sitting still, and had been listening impassively. Now he leaned forward. It is my opinion that we have dealt with the boy in line with policy and his punishment, isolation from his peers for a week, withdrawal of privileges, a member of staff with him during the evenings, all of which support the actions taken by Gifford and Bim on behalf of the Urors. Our staff are aware that I have taken a course of action which is hard on Fraser Bluewit. I understand that, in accordance with their policy, his parents have been visited. Indeed, Herbert sniffed, clearing his throat, before withdrawing his wand. He waved it towards a sheet of parchment, on top of which another appeared, opened by itself. Herbert bent low, squinting behind his spectacles and wrinkling his nose. Indeed. Both Urors called upon the Bluewit family, issuing a notice to them regarding Fraser's transgression. It told them that he was cautioned and, should he break the law again between now and the age of 17, this would result in his arrest. Herbert looked around, waiting for someone to say something. However, it is not my opinion that counts, continued Snape as he filled the silence. I will, as ever, enact the wishes of the Cabinet of the Ministry for Magic. My point entirely, agreed McMullen, reaching for his coffee before slumping down in his chair and crossing his legs again, ignoring the futile scowl from Callias. Then we must vote. Callias, head of the Department of Relations, and, as such, Deputy Minister for Magic, stood up, as was the custom, and he began walking around the perimeter of the wizards and witches, signaling silent contemplation. As he completed a circuit he stopped. I propose that Fraser Blewett should not be expelled from Hedgewood's School of Ministry for Magic and should be dealt. Succinct, thought Snape as the ministers fell silent again. Pertinent. Not, should students who use the M word be expelled, not a general ruling. Just Fraser Blewett. Just this incident. He watched as Cleus began his procession round the table again. 2 more circuits and he stopped again. Those in favor? 8 hands rose. Against? 6. Callias surveyed the wizards again. All had voted, no abstentions. Then we have it. He turned to Severus Snape. You are to deal with Fraser Blewett as you see fit. Snape nodded as chatter erupted in pockets around the table, Evelyn Fortescue and Jane Jones turning towards one another and speaking rapidly. He was about to rise as the ministers chatted when someone spoke above the rest. While we are here, I should like to voice a second proposal, something which may help Professor Snape in his duty as guardian of our young minds. Herbert looked around the wizards. That's why we are all here, isn't it? Indeed, confirmed Cleus cautiously. There was a combined intake of breath. All knew that, starting Herbert on a subject might mean they'd be there the next afternoon, and that was just to hear his scheme. Please continue. From what I can see you have a fundamental flaw in your security at Hedgewood's, Snape. Severus Snape said nothing, staring back at the head of the Aurors impassively. Oh, don't get me wrong, you are doing everything you can to protect the children in your care. No one can ask for more. But undoing all your unparalleled hard work is in the unrestricted access that the students have to the outside world, to wit, portable pensives. I believe they should be banned, Professor Snape, or severely limited at the very least. Did you not say that you suspected Fraser Blewett to be receiving conjurist material at Hedgewood's using his? I did. We have no proof, however. But Oh come on. Dulcie Dainty, her delicate features wrinkling up in disbelief as she interjected. I don't know much about these portable pensive things, but my niece has one and she loves it. To be able to access her friends, her parents, to share music from anyone. Your niece, Miss Dainty, can access anything that has been thought and uploaded. From anyone. Anywhere. But the pensive network is regulated. Isn't it? Dulcie looked sharply at Callias. It is. However, we can only control what is already there. The Flu network is fully occupied with this. New material is accessible for a short time. And so, here we are again, the long arm of the law meddling. Evelyn Fortescue got to her feet. Persecution of the young, this amounts to. What of liberty? What of freedom of speech? What of your staff, Severus, who now, to be equal to the wizards in the European institutions, here she shot a glance at Callias, must be kept abreast of development for their own research interests. We can't uninvent portable pensives. No indeed, Evelyn, said Callias soothingly. However, the Flu network can prevent new, uploaded thoughts getting to influential minds. We have a duty. Their needs and opportunities to broaden their minds must be balanced with responsible care. Teachers will still have access. But if it had already been accessed by someone at Hedgewood's, this overrides the regulations that the Flu network operators put in place. Herbert looked at Evelyn, who was standing there, slightly embarrassed from her outburst, to Dulcie Dainty, whose mouth was opening and closing in shock, unable to speak before looking at Snape. You propose that I ban pensives at Hedgewood's entirely? Snape asked. I know some teachers are integrating their use into lessons, lectures, homeworks, even the students capturing on moving image their potions lessons so they can practice accurate replication. And it would affect the teachers' pensieves too. Herbert shook his head. Only that the flu network accessible by those on roll at Edgewards would be limited, and that limit would be what is accessible by the students only. Your staff would not be affected. That way any questionable material that may have been otherwise viewed is not available. That's all very well, interrupted Jane Jones. But you said anything that had already been viewed could be shared and the flu network could do nothing about it. Across the table McMullen sat up again. Professor Snape, if this were to go ahead, pending a vote here tonight, would you be willing to police the wiping of thoughts already stored on portable pensieves owned by students at Edgewards? Of course. Heads of house could oversee this. Then I think we have a second proposal, for I have long since believed that it is unwise for students to be allowed unlimited access to the pensieve network. I know some parents have allowed the company's block to be put on their child's portable pensieve, a wise move, but equally there are many who have not. You second my proposal, Mick? The Minister for Education nodded. For the second time that evening the ministers voted. For the second time Chilius circled the seated cabinet people, declared the proposal before circling twice more. This time it was unanimous, with Chilius abstaining. I will begin the process in the morning, Snape said, as a limit on the flu network was passed by the cabinet. Students will give their pensieves to their heads of house for viewing and deletion of compromising material. Owls will be sent to parents detailing our actions and explaining the antecedents. How long before access to the flu network is limited to Edgewards? Immediately. I'll send a memo to Arthur Weasley after this session. Shortly afterwards the wizards and witches left the cabinet room. Some shook hands with one another. Dulcie Dainty and Evelyn Fortescue walked out still talking to one another, Dulcie still clearly taken aback because she thought she knew about portable pensieves and what she had subsequently found out. As they left Snape heard the words, Aberforth, and is that what he would have done? Were Aberforth to be here, he thought, perhaps none of them would have such a responsibility. Mick ambled out, saluting all as he left, coffee in hand, Gregor pushing past him muttering about a rota for mucking out the mysteries. As Snape turned to go, making his way towards the cabinet room's fireplace, he felt a hand on his shoulder. I appreciate the outcome, he said as Cleus placed his other hand on the mantelpiece. Anything which allows the school to reflect the outside world only makes us stronger. The students will see that blue wit is to pay for his utterance, acting as his punishment will as a deterrent. The bills are on their way to the Minister for Magic, confirmed Cleus. They are as good as done, such is the nature of law, and the Minister will sign them in the morning. How is old Pettigrew? Asked Snape, unusually conversational about his old school friend. He was unusually conversational about so many things Cleus felt himself rankle. The same, said Cleus. We are lucky to have him. Peter Pettigrew had been headhunted for the European Parliament since its inception but had turned down the role of president 8 times. He was happy, he'd always said, to serve the wizard community of Britain, and this was his priority. However, it also meant that it was unlikely that he would be vacating the position of Minister for Magic in the foreseeable future. But before Snape could take the opportunity to expand on the gloriousness of Peter Pettigrew's perpetual ministryship, Cleus smoothly changed the subject, clapping a hand on the shoulder of the joint head of the reciprocators. So, you have what you wanted? Snape turned and stared at Cleus. It's not a case of what I want, only what is necessary for the students. As you saw, I did not raise or incite discussion. Cleus shifted between feet as Snape continued to stare as the room now emptied. A point well raised by Herbert, I observed. A few of the wizards raised their hands in acknowledgement as they left, to which Cleus responded by nodding. He leaned forward, ignoring Snape's comment. Snape. Severus, he said, Cleus's voice sounding frank, No one, not even Severus Snape, could remember when Cleus had addressed him by his first name. Tell me. He gripped his shoulder. Remus. What chance is there for his recovery? I know. He broke off suddenly before continuing. I know what we say to one another, to the reciprocators, to Septimus. Be honest with me, Severus. What chance has he? What chance have you of saving him, as you did me? At first Snape did not answer. It was unusual indeed for Cleus to address him so intimately. His initial response was to take the opportunity to belittle him, but Snape knew that, above all else, Cleus cared for his family. It would serve no other motive for him to ask so humbly about the prognosis for his brother. You must understand, Cleus, that I am putting in my best effort. But the situation that your brother is in is complicated, far more so than lycanthropy. His medicine, the potion I have devised, is keeping him stable, but there will be a tipping point. It is to our advantage that the potion I am to give him tips it in the favor of blocking the toxin to stop it taking over his cells, from changing his DNA into that of a vampire. He paused, taking in the black silence. He is becoming, or may well have already become, photophobic. His is or very soon will be in need of other people's blood to temporarily replace the cells that have or will change, that refuse to bind with iron. The compounds I am using contain sulfides originating from the ilium family. Garlic, you see, which, when I have found the correct blend, inhibits the change in his cells. So, would I be right in understanding, from the technicalities of your discourse, that you are making progress? I cannot comment on the rate of progress, Cleus, Snape warned. I would not wish to give you false hope. That said, Remus's unconscious state is the best place for him. And you're sure it will work? No, of course not. Snape eyed Cleus with a critical eye. I am sure that my method will answer the question, which is not the same thing. The extent to which it will work in your brother's case is unclear, but it will be correct. I aim for it to work, but I cannot be sure. When, may I ask, will you be sending for Mrs. Lupin? Now it was Cleus's turn to look at Snape coolly. He examined the Hedgewood's headmaster's face, searching for the joke, and was surprised when there was none. It was cruel to force her back to Durmstrang. Surely you must admit that, Cleus, said Snape. On the contrary, she needs to be able to see her husband. Should that be an option, she would still be here, replied Cleus icily. Now, as I've left the potion for my brother in your care, kindly leave politics to me. And with that, Cleus pointed Snape in the direction of the fireplace and turned on his heel, leaving Snape to watch him leave the cabinet chamber, the door closing behind him. 8,888,888. It was a Sunday morning 2 weeks into October, and the students were relaxing in their common rooms, studying in the library, catching up on sleep from the night before, and generally just loosening up after a long week studying. It was now 6 weeks since the start of term, and routines were now well established. Friendships had formed over Quidditch, with students discussing the house and professional Quidditch matches, the former's viewing being planned for that afternoon, the latter's for Halloween, when the students had a day's holiday and were deciding which of the matches of the day they might travel to with friends and family. Other students had bonded over other things, music, being shared by their pensives with ones and twos, sitting listening to the latest music groups and bands, sharing headphones or transmitting snippets of one or two of the songs around common rooms, and, shortly after, being shouted at to turn it off. But not only music. The portable pensives were far more sophisticated than just audio tracks. News, messages between pensive owners, short and to the point over, well, things that girls talked about, the boys keener on games that could be accessed and played three-dimensionally. Wizard chess was always popular, but also Defeat the Vampire, a highly popular game which allowed a player to do as the title suggested. As he looked about the common room, waiting for Julian to return from his checkup from Madame Pomfrey, his cold becoming much better, but still lingering, and Darren from the library, who had gone to stake out the shelves where Madame Pounce, who had assured him that one of the copies of Hedgewood's A History would be returned. It was only after they'd realized their history projects were due in on Monday and that, for his, Darren needed a copy of the book, not being able to use his because it had become an ashy mess on the floor of the Gryffindor dorm floor in an accident involving, well, lots of larking about. Septimus began to feel a little sad. He felt around in his mind for the source of the pain and found that it was focused around his father. It felt like a long time since he had seen Remus Lupin. His father, according to the most recent update that Professor Snape had given to him on Friday, was comfortable, which didn't mean very much, for Septimus had long since figured that adults describing situations as comfortable were trying to fob him off. Somehow it made things feel a little bit worse, especially considering his abject failure to control even a blast-ended scret in the care of magical creatures, care of animals lessons. He watched a group of second-year girls settle across the arms and back of a settee by the flickering fire, pulling out a pensieve, the orb glowing as one of them operated it, as he thought of the project he'd chosen. Natural history, with the emphasis on the fossils. What did he know about fossils, other than what Julian had taught him? He only knew the names of 4 dinosaurs, whereas his friend could name at least 40. Septimus shook his head. Why hadn't he chosen insects? Somehow, he could have managed to fit in a historical aspect, if he'd tried. And if he'd been smart, he could have combined his project with the one that Professor Longbottom would set on Tuesday, killing 2 harpies with 1 arrow, so to speak. He discussed the project, briefly, with Professor Snape and the headmaster, who had come to finish off Professor Longbottom's lesson on Friday and had asked them about what they thought of different animals, and their importance in magical society. Evelyn, a small, round-faced Hufflepuff student, had asked whether the suggestions they'd given were right or wrong, and Professor Snape had declared that opinions couldn't be right or wrong because, as long as you backed up your opinion with a logical reason, it wasn't right or wrong. It's what you think about something, the different angles that are explored, the different ways of looking at something, especially things that are past, that are important, Professor Snape had growled, to the students, listening to him, rapt. We can't go back and recreate history, the origin of these magnificent creatures, so we have to use evidence, declared. Perhaps if someone were to be able to travel back in time, or to different dimensions, then we might know whether something is right or wrong, but until that time that such travel became commonplace, with the exception only a couple of wizards in the whole world who have enough skill to master such feats. And even then it would them a lifetime of deduction before they even dared declare the truth. Well, Septimus recalled himself thinking, as Professor Snape spoke, before taking him off to tell him his father was comfortable, as far as he was concerned. The truth was that he hadn't seen his father for nearly a month, and he really wanted to have the courage to ask someone to take him without feeling that, should they refuse him, he would feel worse about the situation than he did now. If only Mum was there to speak to. He could send an owl, he supposed, but it wasn't the same. Hey! Septimus turned from his semi-melancholic musings and turned. The crumpled face of Rufus Lestrange was staring back at him, a strange, twisted expression which Septimus took to be a smile. What are you thinking about? That was Rufus, asking strange questions. But somehow he, Julian and even Darren had begun to get used to his manner. He and Rufus had bonded a little on their walk back to the Quidditch game, just after he had told Septimus that Mervyn was actually Mervyn Doriel. Septimus has rechristened his now revealed to be female owl, and, despite being more than a little strange, all of them found that they had things in common. Rufus's mum being Minister for Sport was a real asset and had got Darren talking to him, and then Julian discovered that he knew a lot about nature, more plant biology rather than animal, and they had spent most of the match discussing the relative importance of habitat on indigenous animal population around Britain, shifting from wizard to non-wizard perspectives, rather than actually watch the match. Nothing much, just wondering what I'm going to write today that'll give me a pass in history, Septimus replied. That, and Mum and Dad. Rufus sat next to him on the sofa, ignoring the boy to Septimus's right as he yelped when Rufus stood on his foot. I understand. Not that I understand about how you feel exactly, explained Rufus, because my mum and dad aren't away. Well, they aren't here, but dash. Yes, I know, nodded Septimus. He'd soon learned it was the quickest way of getting Rufus to get to his point. Well, anyway, continued Rufus, ignoring the deliberate tuts from the boy next to him as he made himself comfortable, I can understand that you must miss them. So I got you this. He held out a book. On the front cover was a picture of a wizard, his wand aloft and a dinosaur appearing from the end of it. It's crazy, it's mad, when you read it, said Rufus, shaking his head. But some wizards believe that a powerful wizard in the past created everything, even the dinosaurs, and scored fossils into rocks so we had something to find in the future. Septimus stared. Wizardology, the book was called, and he flicked through the book. I know. What some people believe. He broke off and looked at Septimus. But you could use it, I'm sure, to think about what some wizards think, then talk about the evidence that scientists have. It's like Professor Snape said, opinion doesn't have truth as long as it makes sense, and to them, this makes sense. Septimus lowered the book, and smiled at Rufus, his dark, curly hair bobbing as he smiled again. Thanks, Rufus, he said, I'm sure it'll be most helpful. And you'll be able to write to your mum again. Maybe Doriel will be old enough soon to take it herself. She could be, replied Septimus, glancing towards the common room door. Much as he was getting used to Rufus, he didn't bank on the twinge of sadness that had hit his chest, and he wished the boy hadn't mentioned her. I mean, I miss my mum too, but she's only in London. I don't know how I'd be as brave as you. Septimus looked at Rufus. But before he had a chance to say anything, he noticed Julian had appeared behind him. The boy on the other side of the sofa got up with the book he was reading and wandered off to another part of the common room, defeated as Julian blocked his light. Jules. How are you, mate? Yes, said Rufus. How are you? Much better, actually. I'm still on the medicine, but Madame Pomfrey said I'm better than I was. That's good news. Better hope you don't get worse now. Some infections can be like that, commented Rufus conversationally. Julian raised his eyebrows, which was a silent signal to Septimus that he was being weird, and Septimus tried not to giggle. Are you going to the Quidditch this afternoon? Asked Rufus. Septimus looked across to Julian and Rufus turned, as Julian nodded. Great. I'm starving. You coming to lunch? The match won't be long, and I'm starving. We're going to grab some sandwiches and take them down, said Julian. Septimus nodded, then added, I've got this book to read before we come, that you've kindly lent me. Great. Shame, you'll be missing a good lunch, he said, but then added brightly, but I'll bring you some pudding, if I can, and with that, he bounded towards the common room door. Julian sat down. Quite mad, he said, grinning at Septimus, but he's nice, underneath. Septimus nodded. So, are you really all right? Madame Pomfrey said I was better, but not over it yet. She's got in some antibiotics, she thinks it's a virus. I don't care as long as I feel better. You don't really want to go to lunch, do you? Septimus shook his head, glancing down at the book. What did he want? To lend me this. I was thinking about Dad, actually. But strangely, he made me feel a bit better. Julian looked over. Wizardology. Totally mad and stupid, but worth a read, I suppose. He thought it might help with the essay. He actually made me feel better about Dad. He's actually okay, said Julian, getting to his feet. Strange, but okay. Septimus nodded. So, essays first, then Quidditch? Septimus sighed. But Julian was right. He didn't really want to rush it that evening, and the thought of facing Professor Binns and explaining that his work was late was too scary to contemplate. As they made their way upstairs, Septimus smiled. More than okay. If Rufus could be happy being strange old him, then he could go and ask about seeing Dad. 8,888,888. The inquest into the death of Henrietta Edwards was over. It was over, and he and Hermione were able to get on with their lives. Sitting in the living room and watching the highlights of the Quidditch from the day, Harry couldn't help thinking how much it had dominated their lives. Now it was over. The vacant silence of the constant updates of the inquest was almost as loud as constant owls. Declared by Draco Malfoy himself, who had presided over the inquest, Henrietta being a member of the European Wizarding government at the time of her disappearance, the outcome was far from predictable. Considering all of the evidence, including that of Hermione, who had been the last to see her, Henrietta's death had been put down to misadventure, a verdict that reverberated throughout the non-wizard and wizard communities immediately. What did that mean? Hermione had mused, as she snuggled into Harry that night. It means that they either don't know what happened, or they definitely do and don't want to say. They say she was a hero, investigating conjurism. Following a suspect up the Hart's Mountains. Falling to her death from the Ross trap. Harry had said little else, but let Hermione hold him. She had to get it out of her system. It was a shock. And to be the last person to have seen Henrietta was a big burden. Now, a week later, it had seeped through people's consciousness, beginning the process of acceptance. Last week, Sirius was cut up. James had been in the flue talking to Harry before Hermione had returned. His mother had been devastated too. But Hermione was secretly glad it was over. Henrietta was a hero. She had tried to fight the scourge of wizardly fascism. And to be the last person to see a hero was not that bad to bear. And then, that weekend, they had had a long talk about their future, deciding, in the end, to go to Europe, to Strasbourg. Harry couldn't be more pleased. It wasn't as if he couldn't travel to see whomever he liked within minutes. He could commute to London for the time. Ron could easily visit and make the most of the modern television. They had told their parents that morning and both were pleased. Hermione then received confirmation that afternoon that the ministry would expect them at the end of the week. Harry wondered why he did feel pleased about the situation. He would be moving away from his family, true, but apart from the sporadic conjurist attacks, which he couldn't do anything about anyway. Even if he was in the country, things were settled. Sirius had his cure, it was controlling his lycanthropy. Remus was as well as he could be. Sam was safely at school. And it wasn't forever. Hermione was pleased to agree that, once they were married, they would move back and, as an established MWP, could travel to Strasbourg on a daily basis. Harry smiled. They could get out of this house. Not that it was bad, but it just sucked money away in rent, and move to a rent-free apartment. They could save money and Hermione could have the wedding she was dreaming about. He could start by giving everything a good sort out, something which he should have done when he had some holiday in the summer but had never got round to. Suddenly, he got to his feet. Upstairs Hermione would be sleeping, but he would be quiet. He could start with a few things in the cupboard under the stairs, which was the dumping ground for everything they wanted to keep but not be bothered to sort out just yet. Opening the door and trying not to make a noise, Harry turned on the light, the dust swarming around the bulb like minute moths. Boxes, his broken broomstick that needed mending, the cases that they had taken on their last trip, Hermione's work folders, neatly labeled and ordered chronologically. His Quidditch collection of assorted ephemera. Harry began to unpack the cupboard, his sudden burst of inspiration and endeavor driving him on. They could take very little to Strasbourg, so a lot needed to be given away, stored or thrown. and he could start with the big pile of newspapers that sat between their cases, which seemed to have made their way back from the apartment 2 months ago when they last visited the city that was to be their home, albeit temporarily.